Well, thanks for having me. I can't believe, actually, I think it was 6 years since I was here. I think it was 2017. Time flies when you're having fun. It's good to see some familiar faces that were here back then. It's good to see some new faces. It's an honor to be here. I'm a big advocate for Paul and what he's doing up here in Canada. I'm an investor in Canadian microcaps, and I really appreciate the work he does. The presentation that we have here is Multi-Bagger First Principles. Does anybody in this room know who this gentleman is? I'm not surprised. So he's not a 70s or 80s rock star. He's actually a fairly obscure figure even in his home state of Tasmania, which is a state the size of Sri Lanka, about 150 miles south of mainland Australia. But he's now known as the most successful professional bettor in the world. His syndicate of betting between him and his partner, business partner, they place around $10 billion of bets globally around the world and across different sports and different activities. He was born in Hobart, Tasmania in 1953, and from an early age he demonstrated a keen intellect for mathematics and statistics. In fact, he ended up going to college for statistics and graduated near the top of his class. After that, he ended up being an actuary for a number of years before he finally became interested in gambling, and he became a professional bettor in the early 1980s. But now David Walsh's personal net worth is north of $500 million, and it was made almost exclusively from gambling and betting. And we'll get back to his betting and gambling here in a little bit. But one of his loves is art. And in 2011, he actually built his own art museum in the state of Tasmania called Mona. And it's one of the main tourist draws if you go to Tasmania. It gets around 200,000 visitors through that museum every single year. And Walsh has personally spent around $100 million of his personal net worth building out this museum. In fact, I think he's in the middle of a $20 million expansion as we speak. Mona houses over 1,900 pieces of artistic works from David Walsh's personal collection that are valued north of $200 million. This is a picture of French artist Christian Boltanski. In 2010, David Walsh commissioned a work from Christian Boltanski. The work that David Walsh commissioned was called The Life of CB, or The Life of Christian Boltanski. And you might be wondering, what exactly was this piece of artwork? Was it a painting? Was it a sculpture? Well, it was actually a production that involved 3 video cameras being mounted in the artist's Paris studio. The 3 video cameras would live stream Boltanski's activities back to Walsh's museum in Tasmania. It basically broadcast whatever he was doing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 8 years straight. It was kind of like that movie, The Truman Show, from the late 1990s, starring Jim Carrey a little bit. You could basically walk into Mona, this museum, during this 8-year period and just see Boltanski doing anything, eating, working, sleeping, whatever. And you might be wondering, what exactly did David Walsh pay for this rather intrusive piece of artwork? Well, it was never really disclosed, but due to Walsh's gambling nature, there was an interesting bet associated with the purchase price. Walsh agreed to pay the full purchase price over 8 years, paid monthly. And this is where it gets interesting. If Boltanski died prior to 8 years, David Walsh would pay him considerably less. So if Boltanski died in, say, 5 years, he would only pay him 5 years of monthly payments. But if Walsh lived past 8 years, David Walsh agreed to pay him until Boltanski's death. So if he lived for 20 years, he would make considerably more from this piece of artwork, which was basically a recording of his life. Well, guess what happened? Boltanski ended up living for 11 years, and he ended up dying in a hospital in Paris in 2021. And I tell you this story because it gives you a little bit of an idea how David Walsh's mind thinks. I mean, he was an actuary by trade. I'm sure he looked at Boltanski's age, his health, his demographic, his lifestyle, where he lived, and probably looked at the statistics and thought, there's no way this guy lives past 8 years, but he was wrong. But now let's get back to David Walsh's betting strategy. Walsh got his start exploiting inaccuracies in odds offered by local bookmakers in Tasmania before branching out into other sports. His first major successful strategy involved betting on thoroughbred horse races across Australia. And he actually created his own set of probability tables and betting odds that differed significantly from the public odds. By only placing bets when his personal odds differed from the public odds, he created positive expected value. And this is how he built up his early bankroll. As Walsh's wealth grew, he branched out into new forms of betting, from major sporting events to political elections to even lottery systems. And he would hire analysts to study these markets and identify betting opportunities. Some of Walsh's biggest wins have come from identifying structural inefficiencies in betting markets across the world. I'll give you a couple examples. In 2008, in the 2008 Beijing Olympics, Walsh identified inefficiencies in the medal betting markets, and he won over $1 million in profits betting on sports like track and field and swimming. In 2009, Walsh won over $3.5 million betting on the World Cup qualifiers leading up to the 2010 FIFA World Cup. In 2012, during the US presidential election, Walsh bet $1.4 million on a Barack Obama re-election. He hired and identified an arbitrage opportunity between the prediction markets and the bookmakers' odds for that election. He won over $1 million betting on Roger Federer early in his playing career when he noticed that bookmakers consistently underrated the future star. He won over $10 million by taking advantage of bookies' biases against African soccer teams. He even bet on lottery systems. It was back in early in 2022, he ended up buying $10 million worth of German lottery tickets that reportedly paid out over $60 million in winnings. The crazy thing about all of this is Walsh has stated that he loses money on 70 to 80% of his bets, but the 20 to 30% he wins are enough to produce substantial profits. Walsh will only place bets when he identifies a significant edge. Specifically, he looks at human biases and crowd behavior, and then he takes the other side of those bets. Here are some of the human biases he looks to exploit. Pick a number, which is kind of my name for what it is. Long shot bias, hot hand bias, attribution bias, and survivorship bias. Pick a number bias, which is what I call this. If I were to ask all of you, pick a number between 1 and 10, what would you choose? In fact, this is a question that was asked to tens of thousands of individuals in different academic studies. Would you believe that between 28 and 48% of respondents will always choose the number 7 when asked to pick a random number between 1 and 10? And it's partly due to the way the question is phrased. Pick a number between 1 and 10. You're probably not going to choose 1 or 10. Studies have shown that people normally don't choose an even number. So the numbers 2, 4, 6, 8 are out. People won't choose the number 5 because it doesn't seem random because it's right in the middle. And people won't choose 3 or 9 because it's too close to the edges. So what number's left? Number 7. What's also interesting is if I would rephrase this question a little bit and say, pick a number between 1 and 100. Would you believe that 10 to 15% of people will still choose the number 7? And so you can use this kind of to your advantage if there's sports associated with numbers, and that's what Walsh tries to exploit. And another example of this is if you buy lottery tickets, which I do from time to time. I'm sure you do what I do and what everybody else does, which is you choose birthdays. Well, when you choose birthdays, you're choosing numbers between 1 and 31, and you're leaving out all the higher numbers. And what happens is a lot of smart people know that most people choose between 1 and 31, so everybody chooses higher numbers. But what Walsh says is the key is to pick an even amount of numbers, 1 to 31, and an even amount of numbers that are over 31. The next bias is long shot bias. And the way Walsh exploits this is he says long shot bias, as race day approaches, people bet long shots more and more. When race day comes around, people don't view kind of betting on horses like with the odds. They actually just view it like gambling, like buying a lottery ticket. And so he looks to exploit this. He said oftentimes those long shots actually become a poorer and poorer value as race day approaches. Kind of sounds similar to investing, right? Another bias is hot hand bias. Hot hand bias is mostly talked about in sports, which is why it impacts betting so much. The best example is basketball. If a basketball player averages 50%, making 50% of his shots, his field goal percentage is 50%, what hot hand theory would stipulate, if that player gets hot, so they make 2, 3, 4, 5 shots in a row, the field goal percentage for that next shot is greater than that player's average, 50%. Most players and most coaches believe in this. But actually there was a seminal paper written in 1985 that completely debunked the hot hand theory. But like I said, coaches and players still think that it's real. In fact, one of the best players in the NBA, Stephen Curry, was recently asked about it, and he said, "Oh, I know for sure. I know when I make 2 or 3 shots in a row, I know the next one's going in." Well, guess what? A group of academics looked at Curry's statistics the last few seasons. Guess what they found? When he makes one shot, the field goal percentage for his second shot is about the same as the first shot. When he makes two shots in a row, his field goal percentage for that third shot actually dropped 2.5%. When Curry makes three shots in a row, his field goal percentage for that fourth shot actually dropped 7.5% from average. So this data showed not only was the hot hand theory debunked, but the opposite occurred. And I think it also kind of shows how hard it is to change our own beliefs. I mean, I would believe that the hot hand theory would be true. Another version of this is when we overweight trends. And so if a horse wins 2 races in a row, you'll see the odds get considerably worse or better for that horse to win the 3rd race in a row. And this is the type of thing that Walsh seeks to exploit. In public markets, we see hot hand bias or overweighting trends when a company beats earning estimates 1, 2, 3, 4 quarters in a row. The PE on that stock when they beat the first time was probably at 15 times. The PE by the 5th time is probably 70 times. Investors are betting on that hot hand of the business continuing. Another bias is attribution bias, which is when people overvalue certain characteristics when they shouldn't. An example of this is in horse racing. There was actually a gambling guru that created a whole horse betting system based on the weight of the horse. And Walsh looked into this theory and he found it to be completely untrue, but it really had such great influence over the public because everybody started betting on the weight of the horse that he looked to take the other side of that bet. As investors, we tend to overweight certain characteristics as well. I remember I had Jim O'Shaughnessy speak at our summit several years back, and he's a quant, and he's looked at every different way to make money quantitatively. And I remember sitting down with him at dinner and he said, you know, Ian, the data actually shows that large insider ownership doesn't yield higher returns over the long term. It's a belief that investors want to believe is true, but it isn't. And I thought about that for a little bit, and I said, Jim, I said, even if it's not true, it's something that I need for the type of investing that I do. I need to know that management has to live with the consequences of their decisions. But I do think it's important, the point that he was making. I think it's important for us to, excuse my French, not bullshit ourselves. It's important we don't add things to the investing process that don't matter. It's important we are aware of our own biases. It's important we don't overcomplicate an already difficult endeavor like investing. What are the true first principles of multi-baggers? Well, we'll get into that in a little bit. I think what makes David Walsh so interesting is how rational he is. When he talks about his success, he immediately mentions luck and timing, and that there were tons of other smart mathematicians with a similar intellect that made similar strategies that completely failed. He considers himself an outlier because of luck and timing, the luck and timing of his early successes and early losses. Walsh says we all suffer from survivorship bias. We look at someone like himself, David Walsh, or a Jeff Bezos, or Tiger Woods, or Roger Federer, or Michael Jordan, or 100 other super successful people across multiple fields. We love to look backwards at their lives and extrapolate in error. That's all it takes to succeed, when in reality there were 10 million other people that did the exact same things with the same work ethic, same intellect, that were far less successful or even failed. For 99.9% of people, luck and timing just didn't fall into place. It's similar to how we love to look at companies like Constellation Software or Costco or Franco-Nevada and try to form pattern recognition to find the next one. We love to study these massive winners. It doesn't take us long to see copycats pop up in the public markets saying they're the next ones. Even companies that kind of look the same, but they're doing a kind of a similar type of strategy in a different industry or vertical or geography. 10 years ago, how many Canadian microcaps said they were the next Paladin Labs? I swear it was like half the marketplace, right? But very few produced the same as the original. There are 30,000 Elvis impersonators in the world that are paid to impersonate Elvis, and their combined earnings are less than the original Elvis. The big winners, they're usually the originals, and there isn't going to be another one like them, even though we would love to find another one just like them. It would make our jobs a lot easier, right? But it just doesn't happen that way. Speaking of originals, a few weeks ago, we had our Microcap Leadership Summit, and I had Ryan Pape speak at this event. And first off, hats off to Paul Andriola for profiling Expel at 36 cents per share in June of 2013. But we had Ryan Pape there, and I first thought, I was like, man, it'd be great. I'm going to interview him up on stage. And then I was like, you know what? Instead of me interviewing Ryan Pape, how about I have the private investor that made more money than anyone in Expel actually interview him and lead that discussion. And so it was great to have Jason Hirschman up on stage and lead that conversation. And we actually just published that video, that conversation on YouTube this morning. It was an amazing conversation. Ryan Pape became CEO in February of 2009. And on the far left of that chart, and at the very top, if you can squint and read it, it was 4.5 cents per share. You know, that's a 1 million market cap. At the time when he became CEO in February of 2009, he maxed out his credit cards and paid off some company debt. He started buying some stock as well. Expel was doing about $3 million in sales and losing about $500,000 per year. Since then, the company has grown to $350 million in sales, and they grew net income from that loss of $500,000 to earning $50 million. 7% dilution, 150,000% return. Easy peasy, right? Expel, 14 years, 150,000% return. You know, it took Walmart 40 years to get to 150,000% return. It took Monster Energy 20 years to get to 150,000% return. Constellation Software still hasn't done it. And that's the beauty of microcap, right? Expel's still only a $2 billion market cap company. You know, this teaches us what we already know, you know, that you can make a lot of money investing in a small company that becomes a larger small company. This is just a crazy slide here. This is Ryan Pape sold 1,000 shares last month at $75 per share. At the bottom, it lists his cost basis and when he purchased that stock. The 1,000 shares he sold for $75, he had a 4-cent cost basis on. So $75,000 he paid $40 for originally. But what I think is even more impressive isn't the stock, but the leader. It's a very special leader to lead a company from $3 million in sales to almost $400 million in sales. It reminds me a little bit of Sam Walton and Walmart. In 1962, at the age of 44, Sam Walton opened his first Walmart store. And within 30 years, it became the #1 retailer in the United States. He was CEO up until 1988. He was chairman until 1992. So that was 30 years, 1962 to 1992. When he died, he was completely in charge. When he died, they had 1,735 stores. They had 380,000 employees. They had sales north of 50 billion. Walton was in charge. I mean, only an exceptional leader can successfully lead a company from hustle to that type of super scale. Only an exceptional leader is the right leader for the whole journey. So the stock chart is impressive, the business growth is impressive when we look at Walmart or Expel, but the leadership it takes is equally impressive. Here are some of the comments that Ryan Pape made during our summit, during the conversation, which I think a lot of the investors and management teams will find interesting. Here's Ryan Pape on luck, and I'm going to read this quickly. But I think luck is a huge part of all success. There's no question part of our success is that we were the right company with the right brand, the right product, the right time. Ryan Pape on skin in the game, this is one of my favorites. You know, I think it should be required. And skipping back down to the last part of this, if you see that chart of 7% dilution over those 14 years, well, that's a reflection of that. Ryan Pape on making shareholders top priority. He was asked, so I guess since you were CEO in 2009, shareholders were your #1 priority. I love his answer. I think so, but maybe I didn't do it for anyone else. Maybe I did it for myself. I was a large shareholder and am a large shareholder. Ryan Pape on mentors. I love this answer because it's not something you read in a book or case study. My experience was the opposite. I had what I would consider anti-mentors, people that I looked up to and thought they knew what they were doing until I was proven otherwise. I sort of felt like a man on an island in many ways over time. But I think there's some strength that comes from that too, and you're forced to figure out your own way and figure out what you think is right. Temptation on raising capital. No, I haven't been tempted. I believe that having constraints on a business makes it stronger. It's sort of like growing tomato plants in your garden. You don't want to give them too much water. They need to struggle a little bit to be their best, and I think the business is the same way. I think there's a good argument constraints make the business better. That should be framed. Now it's time for me to throw some egg on my face. Right around the same time Paul was profiling this on Microcap Club at 36 cents, I actually visited Ryan Pape in San Antonio and sat across from him. And I think the company at the time was doing around 15 million in sales, growing 25%, slightly profitable. And I remember sitting there and I just didn't get it. They were selling a $2,000 piece of plastic to rich people that drive Porsches and Ferraris. And on top of that, I mean, it takes a bit of work to install this film. You need a professional to install it. To me, it just seemed like an expensive, high-friction experience. How's that ever going to scale? Boy, was I wrong. Insanely wrong. And this is actually the reason I love Expel so much, is because Expel isn't the normal type of business you would expect to see 100x, 200x, 1000x. Expel wasn't some software or SaaS company. It wasn't some serial acquirer buying up things at 3 times EBITDA and using their equity at 15 times EBITDA, or some AI technology or some great story. Expel wasn't a sexy story that kind of fits our framework of what a 100-bagger should be or what it should look like. And I guarantee you, if you heard the story back then, including if you heard the story today of what Expel does, I have this company. They sell paint protection film on cars. No one's going to be like, oh my goodness, that's going to be huge. No one's going to be running out of this room buying that stock, taking the offer. I guarantee it. We love to look back and think this was easy to spot early on. And yes, many of us did. Many of us even visited the company. Paul wrote it up as well. But very few held it for the entire journey. Very few did outside of insiders, except for people like Jason Hirschman. Very few people, not even Ryan Pape, when we asked him during this conversation, he never thought it would grow this quickly, this fast. In fact, the next 100-bagger probably isn't a company you think can 100x. It's not going to be something that looks like Constellation Software or Intuitive Surgical or Amazon. It's probably a company that is misunderstood and underappreciated by the marketplace today. And it makes sense, right? If you look at this chart, the first 2/3 is really a misunderstood company that just kept growing revenues and earnings and not diluting. The last third of this chart is when everyone decides at the same time that this is a great business. Joel Greenblatt has his magic formula. This is the multi-bagger magic formula. This is how Expel pulled it off. In 14 years, grew revenues $3 million to $350 million, grew earnings from a slight loss to $50 million, 7% dilution, that's the kicker, 150,000% return. Last year, Dede Ayisan from Jenga Investment Partners put out a report, and it was pretty interesting. It's available online, it's free. But he studied outperformers, global equity across all global markets. What were the outperformers from May 2012 to May 2022? And what he found was interesting. And he was looking specifically at companies that 10x'd or more during that 10-year time period. 87% of the companies originated out of the microcap ecosystem. In fact, 65% originated out of the nano-cap sub 50 million ecosystem. And here's the kicker. 82% of the companies were profitable. 91% of the companies had some history of profitability. So, as investors, we should be looking at small, profitable businesses. So I would like to leave you with this. This is the multi-bagger first principles. For all the investors in the room, all the CEOs in this room, find undiscovered companies that are growing revenues and earnings and not diluting. This is it, full stop. This is a 200-page book written in a sentence. Remember it, put it on your wall, tattoo it on your spouse's forehead, I don't care. But this is the key to success. If you find a small company that is growing revenues and earnings and not diluting, you need to take that opportunity seriously. Even if it's some small market you don't understand, even if you don't understand how it will scale, you have to take that opportunity seriously. This is what I know Paul looks for, this is what I look for, and this is what many successful microcap investors look for, and so should you. Thank you.